and welcome to Rising Clyde, the Scottish Climate Justice Show. I'm Ian Bruce outside Queen Elizabeth House in Edinburgh, where members of the Edinburgh Climate Justice Coalition, Extinction Rebellion and other movements have come to protest at the new energy and net zero strategy launched by the Westminster government. I've been talking to some of them who say it not only isn't enough, it's going in precisely the wrong direction.
So yeah, we're here outside the UK government building in Edinburgh because yesterday they released their updated net zero strategy. They were basically forced to update it because they lost a court case to Friends of the Earth last year, which said that it didn't have enough detail in it to prove how they were going to keep to their carbon budgets and their climate targets. So they've released thousands of pages of documents yesterday, which supposedly set out how they will reach their carbon budgets, but actually they don't really take us any further along the road to meeting the climate targets. They don't lay out, for example, any plan for a nationwide insulation scheme. They don't say anything about allowing more onshore wind power. They don't say anything about phasing out oil and gas. In fact, they actually commit to maximising the extraction of oil and gas from the North Sea, which is completely opposite to what all the climate scientists are telling us. 700 climate scientists wrote to the UK government last week telling them that they shouldn't allow new oil and gas licensing and the Rosebank oil field to go ahead. The IPCC report that came out last week as well was really clear that we can't be allowing new fossil fuels to be extracted if we want to keep below 1.5 degrees of warming. So yeah, we're basically here today to tell the UK government that we're not going to accept this net zero strategy. It doesn't say anything, it's a complete rebrand of their existing commitments, and we want to see better from them, and that we want to see them making actually strong commitments to phasing out oil and gas, which is at the end of the day what's needed.
I said hey! Oh! Fossil fuels have got to go! I said hey! Oh!
My view is that carbon capture and storage is really a diversion. I mean, I could go on for a long time about why it's not part of the solution, but certainly any significant, even if it worked at scale, which is, there are big questions about, any significant impact of it would be a long time in the future. But much more so, I think it's totally bound up with what's been the one consistent strand of UK government policy over climate, which has been to focus on the interests of the big energy companies. And you know, when they talk about carbon capture, the few examples of it being used so far have all been about actually squeezing the maximum amount of oil and gas out of reservoirs, because what they do is pump the carbon dioxide into the ground to get the bits of oil out that they couldn't have got under normal extraction processes. So I mean, I do get a bit lost for words when you read this, because in any sane world we wouldn't be talking about this at all. I mean, I think I can envisage a time in the future when carbon capture might be something that we would do to an extent, but at a time of climate emergency, when the absolutely overriding objective is to get carbon emissions right down as quickly as possible, investment in carbon capture is a diversion, a waste of time and a waste of money, and it is basically greenwashing. It's trying to make them look as if they've got a strategy when they don't. But I think it's also tied up very much with the other parts of their strategy, which are around kind of hydrogen and nuclear as well, which are different aspects of a similar approach.
Leave the oil in the ground, sing out now, leave the oil in the ground.
So yeah, hydrogen, there's a really large reliance on hydrogen energy in the net zero strategy, but this is largely another diversion. There may be some use for hydrogen in decarbonising heavy industry, but apart from that, the energy that's used to create hydrogen would be much better spent just creating green electricity and using that to electrify different sectors like heating and transport. Hydrogen's really inefficient, it's really expensive, it takes a lot of energy to make, and often it's made by energy that comes from fossil fuels, which then relies on carbon capture, which doesn't exist at any scale yet. So the concept of clean hydrogen is largely not true at the moment, despite having a lot of money already poured into it. The UK government is fully behind the fossil fuel industry to extract every last drop of oil and gas out of the North Sea. That's not even paraphrasing what they are saying. That's a direct quote from their policy. They want every last drop of oil and gas out of the North Sea so that they can make the maximum profit. So this isn't the UK government making profit from it, it's the oil companies making these massive record-breaking profits every year, while paying very minimal tax to the UK government because of tax loopholes, especially in their windfall tax, which actually incentivises oil and gas companies to keep on drilling for new oil and gas. So you can see the influence of the oil and gas industry in the UK government's policies. It's really clear that they've been lobbying behind the scenes and showing and like asking for policies that are much more sympathetic to them and are in their best interest rather than in the best interest of people who are struggling with their energy bills, for example.
Stop! Rosebank! Stop! Rosebank! United, stop! Using Rosebank, stop! Rosebank!
3.75 billion is a tax break on offer for Equinor now if they go ahead with development. That's money that could be used for a green transition, for ensuring no one falls below minimum energy requirements, or for ensuring that every public sector worker receives a real pay rise.
Rosebank is the biggest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. For months and months now, it's been kind of delayed, and there's been a lot of back and forth between the UK government's regulator and Equinor, the company that's asking to develop the licence. It's finally reached the desk now. We've heard of Grant Shapps, who's the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, so he's the final decision maker on the Rosebank licence. So it's important to add that Rosebank already has a licence. It's not part of the most recent licensing round for oil and gas. It's had a licence for years, and now Equinor is ready to start developing it, but they need this final permission from the UK government in order to do that. So within the next week or 2 weeks, Grant Shapps will have to make a decision on Rosebank. Lots of people have been telling him that this is a terrible idea. The UK Labour Party has now come out against Rosebank. Loads of MPs have been asking questions in Parliament about it. There are a lot of MSPs as well that are against Rosebank. 700 scientists have written to the UK government saying Rosebank would be a bad idea. Even Equinor's investors are writing to the Norwegian government, which is the majority stakeholder in Equinor, to tell them that they don't think Equinor's net zero policies are good enough. So it's really, really clear that we can't allow Rosebank to go ahead. The UK government just needs to see this and stop it from happening.
What's the Scottish government doing about it?
The Scottish government itself hasn't made a clear statement on Rosebank. They've said that they don't think that new licences should be allowed to go ahead. But since Rosebank already has a licence, it kind of falls through the gaps in this policy. So they haven't said anything specific on Rosebank, although individual MSPs have. So ideally, they would come out and say strongly that they think that Rosebank shouldn't go ahead. They did this for Cambo. Nicola Sturgeon in 2021 said that she thought the Cambo oil field shouldn't go ahead, and really soon after that Shell pulled its funding from the oil field. So it makes a really big difference, the Scottish government's opinion on these things, especially if they stay really strong in their messaging. So we'd really urge the Scottish government to come out against the Rosebank oil field and make sure that it doesn't happen, even though they don't have direct decision-making power over whether it's allowed to go ahead or not. They do have significant influence, so they should use that to make sure it doesn't go ahead.
No more gas, no more oil!
Keep your carbon in the soil!
Looks at the moment as if there's going to be a kind of continuity with Nicola Sturgeon, but there's a consultation out at the moment on energy policy, and that doesn't bode well for the future, really. I mean, I'm just picking up what Freya was saying about hydrogen, for example. I mean, people, I think, find some of the issues about the kind of inefficiency of hydrogen, for example, quite hard to get their head around. But a couple of things that illustrate that is, at the moment, almost all hydrogen that's produced in the world for a variety of different purposes, industrial and agricultural and so on, all of that is dirty hydrogen that produces lots of carbon dioxide in the process of manufacturing. If we were to turn that green by using electrolysis instead, we would need 1.5 times as much electricity as the whole of all the world's renewables at the moment to do that. That gives you some indication of, and that's just to keep hydrogen as it is, but actually the Scottish government and lots of other Western European governments have got targets to increase hydrogen production by large amounts. And if you look at some of the things in the draft energy policy, they're talking about a new wave of offshore wind, for example. That's okay, although there are issues about ownership and the future of that. But they also say that Scotland starts becoming a centre for production of hydrogen as well. In fact, it takes all of the new electricity capacity that they talk about in their policy to produce the amount of hydrogen they're talking about. So it's just a crazy system. And so in a way, the Scottish government, although it's really welcome that they've started to question things like North Sea oil and gas production, because up till now they are still fully signed up members of the North Sea transition deal, along with the Westminster government and sadly the major trade unions that are offshore too. But it's been very good that they've started to question that, but they are still totally bought in to some of the underlying things in the Westminster strategy as well, around carbon capture and hydrogen and so on. And we really need to win a big break to that, because until we won't get I'll put it a different way. The investment that goes into all those things is wasted investment if you're interested in cutting carbon emissions. We need direct investment in all of the things like public transport, retrofitting homes and so on, that will really make a difference and really drive down carbon emissions. That's where the priority is, and it's a priority for now, not for 20 years' time or 25 years' time, when as they often push these things off to.
No more gas, no more oil. Keep your carbon in the soil. No more gas, no more oil. Keep your carbon in the soil.
So beyond the policies of the two governments, what do the movements need to do now to turn this around?
I mean, that's the really important question, and I think we just have to build power, really, build power to change things, and that means a number of things. I mean, it means actually reaching out to much wider sections of society, because my feeling is that most people are concerned about climate change, but they also mostly don't think that we can do anything. But things are changing. I was up in the northeast, the Murray Coast, a couple of weeks ago, with a public meeting in a small town called Buckie, which has got the highest proportion of people who work offshore in it of any town in Scotland, I think. And to be honest, not very long ago, I think if you'd had a public meeting in Buckie, you'd have probably got run out of town for questioning the future of the oil industry. We had loads of oil and gas workers at the meeting, and they were united in the view that there should be an end to production of oil and gas in the North Sea. They were really serious about that, but what they didn't have was any confidence that there was going to be any social justice involved in that transition. They think there should be a transition, but they'd like to be involved in renewables, and it's really hard for them to make that step.
Yeah, so it's really important to be representing the actual voices of workers in the oil and gas industry. When we're looking at solutions, that's exactly what a just transition means. Workers need to be at the centre of decision making. So so Friends of the Earth Scotland and Platform has worked with a load of oil and gas workers and surveyed a much wider proportion as well, and come up with 11 demands that, or 10 demands that reflect the needs of the workers within this just transition. So they cover things like training and decision making, union representation, and it's really, really important that governments take these into account when they're planning for a transition away from oil and gas. We can't just allow workers to be dropped and communities to be abandoned by the industry and the government support, because a lot of people and families and communities rely on the oil and gas industry currently. So we need to make sure that there are other jobs for them to go into and training in order for them to make that transition.
I think it shows that people want to do stuff. It's just that, the question you asked earlier, Ian, about what do we do? We have to move to a place where people start feeling that we've got enough power to make politicians do what they need to do, rather than just asking them what to do. Because at the moment, in rhetoric, they sometimes seem to be responding to us. But if you take the Parliament just down the road, we're outside protesting quite a lot. Actually, the oil and gas industry is in there most days of the week, bending the ears of MSPs and ministers and so on. And we need to turn that around. We need to make it sure that they can't get in there, and that the voices they hear are from climate campaigners. I think one of the things which I think has happened a little bit in the last few months is that in the kind of new wave of industrial disputes, I think lots of the people involved have actually been really interested in how pay and working conditions links to cost of living, and that links to climate. I don't think at the top level the unions have taken that seriously enough, but I think it's a really big step forward that those conversations are taking place, and it's a first step to actually beginning to have a kind of political industrial movement that puts climate at the centre of everything. Because for me, we've reached a point in our history where you can't talk about a decent future unless you talk about climate all the time, not as an add-on, not as something separate, but as something that's integral to everything we organise and fight around.
So come on, and play with freedom, never heed what the hoodies groan for doom. In your house all the bands are idle, we'll find green, body green painted blue. When the clay meets with rent in spring, but all the roses and keeps will turn to blue. And the blackguards beyond my anger, things the fell gallows of the burghers do.
Thank you so much to our guests. That's all for this episode of Rising Clyde. I'm Ian Bruce in Edinburgh. Until next time.